Our next presenter couldn't actually be here in person, and he's joining us from Zoom. So we're going to test our technology, and Brett's on top of it. But before I do so, I do want to introduce him. As educators, we all have students who have great difficulty connecting with learning. I think most of us are constantly looking for ways to engage, inspire our students to learn. Unfortunately, we do not always succeed, and there is sometimes disparity between what educators believe to be effective and efficient learning strategies, and those are supported by empirical research. Our next speaker, Mr. Tony Kirton, founder, Engaged Learning and Development in 2013 for this very reason. Tony recognised the need for training and design and delivery that engages learners in a way that inspires them to act on their learning. Tony is an instructional designer, a workshop facilitator with more than 10 years experience in learning and development. Tony has an extensive experience in the application of learning design theory, having designed many training programs and hundreds of assessment resources. I've heard Tony previously at the National DEC conference run by VELG, and I'm sure that you'll benefit greatly from what Tony has to share with us today. Please welcome Mr. Tony Kirton visiting us online.
That's a really nice introduction there, Fred. Thank you for that. Almost as though I'd written that myself. Perfect. Give me a wave. This is a little unorthodox for me, folks. I'm looking at the back of heads, which I don't normally do. So give me a wave just to turn around so I can see. There's a lovely, friendly face down the front there. Fantastic, fantastic. I mean, we've got lots of, I've got lots of good content for you. So you will be looking up at the slides there today, and I'm sure you can see me. Actually, yes, I can. Yeah, it's good to be with you, albeit via Zoom. So yes, we'll be checking our tech. Look, that introduction sort of says it all, gives us a nice lead in for what I'm talking about today, folks, and that is what you see on your screen there. This idea of cognitive load theory, which undoubtedly you've probably heard something about. This is not a new idea. It's not a new theory. It's been around for a little while. And the sort of precursor to this is all around, well, engaging your students, of course. And there was a nice talk, a couple of talks ago around engaging students or preventing disengagement. And this theory does not only that, but as I hit my timer, does not only that prevent disengagement, but enhances engagement. So you'd know as a teacher, one of the things, I suppose, the bare minimum thing that we want to do is prevent disengagement of our students. One of the ways to achieve that really quickly, to disengage people, is to overwhelm them. I don't need to tell you that as teachers. You'll be very, very familiar with it. And this idea, cognitive load theory, addresses that very issue. That is trying to avoid overwhelming your students. So what is it? I mentioned this is not a new idea. If you're familiar with cognitive load theory, you would know that cognitive load has been looked at since at least the early 80s, say mid-80s. But as was mentioned actually by Fred in the introduction, there is, if you're familiar with the cognitive sciences, as undoubtedly many of our group will be, you'll recognise that there's often a gap between what the evidence tells us works in the classroom versus what is applied in the classroom. And that gap can be quite large sometimes, where an idea is, where the evidence tells us we should be doing this, and it takes some time to actually be applied in the classroom, and it can be a little less. This particular idea, this particular theory, evidence-based theory, has gained a bit of traction over the last, let's say, decade, at least in the last 5 years, where people have, you could say, finally are paying attention to the importance of working memory and catering to the limitations of working memory in order to form long-term memories. So this is, I suppose, one of the, you're probably familiar with Dylan Williams' work, famed British educationalist. He came out maybe 4 years ago, and he made this statement that you see on your screen. And if you're familiar with Williams' work, you would know this is a pretty big statement for him to come out and say, this is the single most important thing for teachers to know. Now, Williams' work is the area where you work in, that is primary and secondary education. So this theory has primarily focused in that area, in the university sector as well. Most of the evidence sits in those two areas, with a little bit in the vet sector, but the application is still the same. Interestingly, around the same time, around about the same time that Williams came out with that comment, you may be familiar with the Department of Education, New South Wales Department of Education, released a literature review on this very topic, with some practice notes, of course, that was an adjunct to this, with a very, very similar title. Research that teachers really need to understand. And I couldn't agree with this more, whether we're in the vet sector and any other education sector, understanding this theory and its implications is particularly important. And that's really what I'm going to talk to you about today, give you a bit of an overview of cognitive load theory, distill it down to sort of 3 key points, and then give you 6 or 7 principles for application. That's not all of the principles, that is just a very few, given the time constraints that we have today. One important note before we dive in, and that is that sometimes when we see the word theory, people can think this is untested, there isn't an evidence base, it's purely theoretical. Well, nothing could be further from the truth when we're talking about cognitive load theory. There is a metaphorical mountain of research, both in the lab and, importantly, in the classroom, in a multitude of environments. Some of the principles I'm going to give you today have more than 30 peer-reviewed in-class studies that support them. So this is not like maybe other theories you might be exposed to, which don't have a solid evidence base. This is quite the opposite. So I'd like you to get involved today. You'll be familiar with Slido. If you're not, well, it's really easy to tune in. If you've got a mobile phone and it's connected to the internet, which undoubtedly you will, really simple 2 steps. Get involved with us today. I've got some polls that I want to ask you, some multiple choice questions to get you thinking about this topic. And in fact, I've got one coming up on the very next slide. So there's a couple of ways that you can connect. 30 seconds to do this, super simple, folks. QR code if you're tech savvy. If you're like me and you're a bit old school, just Google it. Just Google Slido. It'll take you to the participation page, I think they call it. And our code today, you can see there, is vote. Just vote. Uppercase, lowercase, combination of the above. It doesn't matter, whatever your keyboard is doing. So do that for me now if you can, if you're not already. It won't take you long. And if you're doing that as per the instructions, you'll get a screen something like this. Something like this will appear on your mobile device, and it'll say Q&A, and there'll be polls. And if everything's working correctly, there should be no polls activated just yet. And there's no Q&A. We've got Q&A at the end. But if you do have a burning question, you can pop it in the Q&A throughout. But we've got a section for that, as Fred's probably highlighted already. Give me a hand up if you have done that, if you've successfully logged in. Okay, most of the room, tech-savvy audience. That's what we love, right? Excellent. Well, here's my first question for you. Here's my first question. I'm not going to read that. I'll let you read it. All I will say is that there is a correct answer. This is not a subjective question. There is a mountain of evidence on this. There is a right answer. So vote now, have a read I'll be quiet. Don't be influenced by others, of course. Avoid the bandwagon effect. Make sure you make your own decision. You never know. Other people might not be quite right. Who knows? I'm not trying to cue you or anything there. We're seeing the second answer increase after I say that. I shouldn't influence the group in any way. We've got about 50 responses. That's pretty good. I might give you about 8 seconds just to finalise that. Still a few votes coming in. Well, I'll give you a moment to, I'm going to hold off on the answer for this. I'm going to keep you in suspense just a little bit. Like I said, there is a correct answer for this. When we're talking cognitive load theory, we know what the literature says on this. It's very, very clear. There's a particular effect that this relates to. We're going to look at that in just a moment. Firstly, nice and quick, some of them a little bit more in depth that you can go and apply in your classroom. So firstly, what is CLT? What is CLT? CLT is underpinned by 3 key ideas. And the first 2 of those relate to concepts you'll be familiar with, known as cognitive load and cognitive limit. Now, cognitive load refers to, when we talk about cognitive load, we're referring to the working memory resources that a person, you, me, everybody else out there has to use, has to expend in order to complete a particular task. Particularly a task that we don't have a good long-term memory mental model around. So particularly a new idea, if we're being taught something, for example, we might be dedicating a lot of working memory resources to grappling with a particular mathematical formula, maybe a set of principles that relate to project management or work health and safety that we're trying to get our head around. That's cognitive load. Cognitive limit refers to the actual amount of resources or the limitations associated with our working memory. And you'll know as well as I do that this is very, very limited, very, very limited. The work on this varies a little bit, as you probably will appreciate. There is some work that shows that the limit is about, with novel information, is about 5 to 7 items at any given time, right? So if you think about that in terms of numbers, we can kind of deal with 5 numbers, hold them in our head, 5 to 7. We're kind of dealing with averages, some people more, some people less. There was some work that was done maybe about 6 or 7 years ago that showed that it was even less than that. It was even less than that, sort of 3 to 5. And there's even been some work in recent years that shows that some people, that it can be quite individual. Some people can have quite a less, let's say, cognitive limit than others. So you might have students in your classroom who can really hold quite a number of novel concepts in mind as they're processing something new, whereas others may not. So, but whatever it is, it's very, very limited. Now, the other concept that is important within cognitive load theory is what we call mental schema, the formation of mental schema. So cognitive load theory is based on the first 2 ideas, but then appreciating that once information gets through that working memory, that sort of gateway, and once a long-term memory is formed, another way to think of a mental schema might be a mental model of how something works. The brain, that information, once a long-term memory is formed, we actually don't expend any working memory thinking about that, right? So it doesn't take any working memory to think about something that you are well-versed in, that you've got expertise in. And what's interesting at the moment in 2022, there appears to be no known limit to the amount of information, the amount of items that a person can deal with at a given time if they have a well-developed mental schema. Now, you'll know this. If you're very, very good at something, you can kind of just hold multiple things relating to that topic in mind, assess them almost and take on something new. And you can do that because your working memory isn't expending any resources on that topic that you're already an expert in. So the important part of cognitive load theory is all about, well, if we can help people or we can deliver content in a way that is within the cognitive limit, is within these restrictions, and we don't overwhelm people, we've got a better chance of helping them form a long-term memory, a mental schema. And then once that's formed, well, they can process that information very, very easily. They can complete that task almost without thinking about it, without having to expend any working memory resources. It's what we might think of when somebody is competent. It's one way of thinking about competency within VET. Now, within that, we've got three forms of cognitive load, folks. Stay with me on this. There are three forms. Some of them are bad, some of them are good, and some of them are just, well, they're just there. The first one is not great, and that is extraneous cognitive load. We've got intrinsic cognitive load, and we've got germane cognitive load. Let me explain each one very quickly. Extraneous cognitive load is cognitive load that we should be avoiding at all costs. Extraneous cognitive load, I think of it like the fluff on your shirt, on your jacket, on your dress before you're going out. You probably want to get rid of it. The fluff that adds no value to a course, to the learning objectives, to the curriculum, but it's there anyway. And this stuff, as curriculum designers, as instructional designers, as teachers, as trainers, whatever your role happens to be, this is the stuff that we should be removing. And you might think, well, isn't this obvious? You might think, well, surely there aren't curriculums out there that are full of stuff that is irrelevant and doesn't add value. Well, I can tell you, I'm not sure what your experience is, but working in VET and having designed hundreds of learning programs and literally now thousands, more than 1,000 assessments from 30 different qualifications, I can tell you that I see this a lot. I see extraneous information that adds no value to the course, that the person has to process, is included in content, and it needs to be removed. So that's the first one. The second one is intrinsic cognitive load. And intrinsic cognitive load is one of those things that we can say, well, it's just one of those things. Intrinsic cognitive load relates to the task itself. You'll know, as well as I do, that some tasks are just more complex than others. Some of them have more moving parts. There's more elements to certain tasks. And so in cognitive load theory, we think of complexity as when a task has high element interactivity. High element interactivity. That is, in order to complete this task, I have to incorporate multiple elements. I have to think about those, hold them in mind, and I have to integrate them. Now, there are a myriad of tasks that might completing a mathematics task. The classic one for me is designing assessment tools. They're designing a curriculum. There are multiple things we have to keep in mind to bring it all together to achieve a particular outcome, to achieve a particular task. You know, you're cooking at home when you bring a few people over for dinner and you're trying something new, you try a new novel dish, and maybe you overwhelm yourself a little bit. it's a bit new for you. You think, hey, I'll try this and this and this, and there's a lot going on in the kitchen. That is an intrinsically, there's high element interactivity. You've got to bring it out at around about the same time, put it on the plate, etc. So it's all relatively warm, high element interactivity. And the last one, this is good. This is a cognitive load that we want. We want people to have some room left over in their working memory so they can do this. This is germane cognitive load. And germane cognitive load is you can think of it as the mental effort that is required for a person to integrate a new idea into an existing mental model, existing mental schema. So you're presenting me information and I'm thinking, okay, well, where does this sit? Where do I classify it? Where do I put it? How do I pop it into what I already know? Now, you'll know as teachers, this is the good stuff. This is what we want people doing. Unfortunately, if we overwhelm them, if they're overwhelmed with the first two, they don't get to this. So let's get into some principles. The first lot, and we're going to do this in order, I'm going to give you a few relating to extraneous cognitive load. And the first one, of course, well, we're going to revisit our slide. Now, or our poll, I should say, which is the correct answer? Well, believe it or not, the first answer is correct. The first answer is correct. So 58% of you are in the right area there. There absolutely is a material difference between these two. There absolutely is. And I can tell you the evidence is unequivocal on this, folks. If I was to, and this is known as the redundancy principle, that is that the brain cannot, if I'm speaking and I read that slide to you, you can only take in one form of information. Your brain cannot read it and listen to me at the same time. If I say people learn better from images and narration than from images, narration, and on-screen text, those two mediums, one of them will be redundant. Now, what's interesting is not only will one of those be redundant, either you'll ignore what I'm saying and you'll read it, or you'll read it, or ignore the text and you'll listen to what I'm saying. What's interesting is when we expose people to this, they actually retain less. So while this is a relatively straightforward concept, it's often not well understood. And that is that when we're delivering something, or it's not always practiced, when we're delivering something and we've got, for example, the classic example, of course, is what you're seeing now. We've got a slide deck. I should never read what's on that slide unless I've given my audience an opportunity to read it first. So I might say, hey, have a chance to read through that, but I'm never going to read the text. And so the golden rule, of course, that's the golden rule of PowerPoint, isn't it? That you don't read what's on the slide. And if you want to say what's on the slide, it shouldn't be on the slide, or it should be images and very short keywords. Very short keywords. And you might think, well, where else does this apply? Well, this applies to any multimedia environment, whether you're creating a video, whether you're putting together a short e-learning program. We never narrate over the text that's on the screen. We might include short key points, but we don't cover it today, but the multimedia principle comes into play, that people learn better from images and short text than they do from text alone. So there's principle number one. The other one relates to, remember, we're sticking with extraneous cognitive load here in the first instance. The second is what we call the coherence principle. And the coherence principle, it makes quite a simple claim, a relatively obvious one, but one that in my experience isn't always practiced. And that is that people learn better when extraneous or the fluff, the not useful information, to put it another way, is removed rather than added. You might think, well, that's the blinding flash of the obvious, but like I've said, often we see it breached, either in slides which are too heavily populated, which should be split apart, whether we see extraneous information such as irrelevant images that have no bearing on the text at all. So the brain looks at that image, must go, okay, well, that's irrelevant. Now I can get back to the text. And I call these decorative images. You see this a bit these days. People go onto these various Creative Commons websites and they grab an image and they think, I'll pop it there, but it has no relationship to the text. Doesn't add value. Whether it's something simple as logos on every page, on every e-learning screen, or even on your whatever you're using. I'm going to say PowerPoint, but it could be Google Slides, etc., etc. And these sort of irrelevant. I was asked to present. This was probably 3.5 years ago. A presentation masterclass for a very, very large corporate. And on every single slide, masterclass, which was an international program designed in Germany. And on every single slide was today's date, the name of the course, and a slide counter. So people could feel as they were being killed Microsoftly as every slide was going through. And one of the first things I said to the organizer, I said, we need to remove this irrelevant, extraneous information, this footer. Why is this footer on every single slide? And it's a masterclass. So this is, we see this quite a bit. I don't know what your experience is with it, but if it doesn't add value, remove it. Here's another breach. This is, I removed the names of companies to protect the guilty. And this is another breach. I mean, most of my examples are vet. I work in vet, so that's where you'll see some of this stuff. You can see here, just a quick glance, this image bears no relationship to the content that's above. This was in a sort of what we might call a learner workbook, a resource for students learning about assessment. Of course, if you were to look at that and you would think, okay, well, how does this relate? It actually doesn't relate. One is talking about something different and one is talking about something quite specific. What the designer should have done if they wanted to make a graphic out of that text, if they wanted to do that, is do something like that. That is going to, what you're seeing on your screen is going to be much more effective from a cognitive load perspective than something like this. The student is looking at that image and thinking, well, okay, what is that? Is that a decoration? It adds no value. So the bottom line, I suppose, with this one is it's about design, not decoration. Very quick one on this, quite a simple one, as we finalise on our extraneous cognitive load principles, and that is the signalling principle. A simple one, but an important one in whatever literature you're giving to students. Again, whether it's an e-learning program, whether it's in your Google Slides, whether it's on your paper-based resources, whatever it might be, the signalling principle. I'll let you read that. Quite a simple one, but we often see it breached. And we see it breached in the reverse. That is that, people learn better when we highlight to them the important points in a page. And you might think, well, that's pretty obvious. But what we see is maybe too much use of bold text or inaccurate use of the signalling principle. So some things might be italicized, but they're actually not the most important point. Color being used in the wrong places. So the signalling principle is really about thinking, okay, what are my key points on whatever I'm using? And how can I highlight that to my audience, my students, et cetera, et cetera? We know that cognitive load will be reduced if the person can simply highlight, okay, where are the key points? Where do I need to focus? And of course, you think about kids learning to read. Certainly my daughter, who's age 7, one of the signaling, they use the signaling principle just by pointing at the words as they're going along. And I know that that's in some areas is removed, but it's certainly something I encourage my daughter to continue to do. Point to the words as you're going along. That is the signaling principle in practice. Let's have a quick look, couple of principles around intrinsic cognitive load. You'll remember that this particular principle relates to the task itself. So, of course, some tasks are more complex than others. And of course, there are some principles that we want to use to help reduce or manage, I should say, not reduce, manage that task complexity. The first one is the spatial contiguity principle, the spatial contiguity principle. And this principle simply says that text, when we're producing something in a text format, people learn better when that text is as close as possible to an image, or even, if possible, within that image. You might think, well, and you might think, well, how do they measure that? When we look at the micro movements of a person's eyes. So where do they have to go to find the information relative to an image? And we're often using images when we're conveying things. Here's an example of a breach. This is a minor breach of the spatial contiguity principle. You might think that's not too bad, but this is a breach. The person has to look above and then try to draw the relationships between that explanation and that image. It would be much better to simply do that. That versus that. Now, that's a very, very subtle change, but that helps reduce the cognitive load relating to a potentially complex subject. Doing simple things like that with your images, whether you're designing the curriculum or even if you're delivering it, making a small adjustment. Here's another one that I picked up, a classic breach. This was worse than the first one, given some resources to redesign. The designer had, this is a classic hierarchy of controls in WHS course. And here we had the explanations. They actually went over the page. So we had the image, and to a novice, they have to read those explanations. They have to turn over the page and go back to the image, so on and so forth. That increases cognitive load. You can imagine, if you have to go to an appendix or maybe to another document or to a link, I've got to click the link to get more information here. So you can imagine the expansion of this. It's not just on a page or wherever it might be. Anywhere I have to go further. And this is kind of user experience 101, isn't it? This might be an alternative. And you could think of a myriad of ways to present that information. Hierarchy of controls. This was the explanation text was taken from the workbook. So we just redesign it. Okay, here we've got the image. This is what we're trying to do. Pop them a little closer together. This is an example of where, we can't put all the text in that pyramid to get too messy. So we put it along the side. Spatial contiguity principle. Grab your mobile phone. Here is our second poll for you folks. Again, there is a right answer. There is a right answer. Wayne, let's see what, I'll zip it. I'll let you read that. Almost finished, Fred. It's a bit of even. This one's a little more even. little bit more conjecture in the room. I like that. Wow. Give you 10 seconds. 10 seconds, and then we'll reveal the answer. Three, two, one. Well, the answer here is 33% of you have hit the nail on the head here. People learn better complex subjects if they're introduced to at least the key terms, and principles and possibly even methods prior to being introduced, prior to the main lesson. Now, this is, I get that this is a bit of a logistical challenge, right? So how do you get content to people prior to? But there are ways of doing that, of course, in this world of online delivery. We don't have time to go there, but I can see people still voting, even though I've given the answer already. That's brilliant. Very, very good. So it's definitely prior to. And what is this? This relates to what they call the pre-training principles. So if you've got a complex task and your students are new to it, you're better off delivering a short session, bit of content, however you deliver that, whether it's via an e-learning medium, maybe a webinar, maybe a face-to-face, where you explain the key concepts, key terms, possibly key methods, maybe that are used in this complex task, prior to the main lesson. Now, you can have a look at as to why this might be. There's some stuff around, well, the brain gets a bit of time to consolidate it. There's some evidence that shows that the very act of sleeping helps to consolidate that information. We don't have time to explore that today. But this is an important principle. If you're delivering complex content and you think, my team are going to have, my students are going to struggle with this, how can I make it easier for me and for them in the lesson on the day? A logistical challenge, but an important one nonetheless. So we talked about that. Final two principles, and they relate to the good stuff. The germane cognitive load, the effort that it requires to put this stuff into long-term memory, to link it all in together with what I already know. Final live poll, and this is an important one, folks. This is really important. Have a read. Yeah, there's a bit on here, so have a good read. I'll give you 15 seconds. Five seconds. Fantastic. Fantastic. I think we'll take that right there. Now, interestingly, this poll relates to the founder of this theory we're talking about today, John Sweller. You might be familiar with his work. He's an Australian professor. I'm not sure if he's still practicing, but nonetheless, he's got some good stuff. But he came up with this theory, and it's been expanded on since. But he described this as the number one principle if you had to apply any of these, and there are more than 24, 25 of these principles. We're only covering a few today. But he described this as the number one principle. And the answer here, 70% of you are correct. 70% of you are correct. And that relates to, the answer relates to the worked example principle. That is that when we're wanting people or wanting to help people integrate a idea, new novel idea into existing mental models, there is no better way to do that than providing people with, of course, first explaining the methods and procedures and principles that relate to that topic, but then showing them a worked example and then getting them to diagnose that worked example. Specifically, how does this adhere to the principles? How does it not adhere to the principles? And giving them feedback on that. Now, this is sometimes contrary to what we see, at least what I see in VET, which is get people to create one first. That is a bad idea from what we know from the research. Giving people, novices, just throwing them in and say, hey, I'll give you feedback as I go along, that the literature just doesn't support that approach. So this can be time consuming to develop, I get that, but this is a really important principle to try to build in. And it sounds like many of you are already doing it because many of you knew the answer. Final two very quick ones. The final, or the second last I want to give you here today is what we call the self-explaining principle. Great way to help people enhance germane cognitive load, create those connections with new content and existing mental models, is getting them to put it into their own words. What's even more powerful is getting people to create analogies. And even more powerful, interestingly, is getting students to formulate metaphors, which is quite complex, right? So that's a bit of mastery happening there. Metaphors around a particular idea. Or just analogies, this is like this or this is like that, and creating a bit of a story around that. So self-explaining principle, of course, we can have a bit of fun, but get students engaged with that, of course. And the last one is one that I love to do, and maybe you can do that with some of the content that you've heard today at today's conference, which is you leverage the generative drawing principle, what they call the generative drawing principle. And that is getting your students to create drawings of the key concepts that you've been delivering. This is a great recap activity, maybe throughout the day or at the end of the day, people can have a bit of fun with it. And what's interesting, because I've looked into this one quite a bit, a final thought. I thought, well, wouldn't it depend on people's ability to draw? You know, that if the person isn't a very good drawer, this wouldn't work. But that isn't true. Apparently, the quality of the representation doesn't matter so long as the student creates it themselves. What's interesting is if the person has some basic drawing skills, they do get more out of it. So if someone can animate a little bit, they do get a bit more out of it. But it's not lost just if you think, well, I can't draw. I'm not very good at drawing. So anyway, a bit of fun with that one. I certainly have a lot of fun with it as a facilitator as well. I'm going to finish there, but I'm going to leave you with a quote from Sweller and Co. A good way to finish. He came up with this theory. And look, I'll be hanging around for questions. So we might see you then. Thanks for participating. Bye for now.
Thank you, Tony, and really appreciate for engaging the audience just before lunch so we can all be recharged for lunch. But we really appreciate your work, and we hope that we can catch up with you in Sydney very soon. So thank you for joining us.